Oh.
This computer. So welcome everyone. Good to see everybody here. So let's just sit up straight with our feet on the ground if that's comfortable to you. And closing your eyes would be a good idea. I'm going to close mine. Focus on your breath. Do I hear someone? I hear these beeps. Oh, that's okay. I think it's somebody joining us by phone. Okay. So let's just focus on our breath. Feel the breath come in and out through your nostrils, and have your hands resting on your lap with your palms up. Just feel grateful for the breath. Imagine your breath is entering through your third eye on the in-breath and out through the heart. Just breathe normally. Feel grateful for every breath. And slowly open your eyes. And I'm going to unmute Colleen as soon as there she is. And she can actually unmute herself if she wants to.
Okay. Thank you, Tada. It's so beautiful to start our meetings by being peaceful, because it all comes from within ourselves. Oh, wow. Anyway, I'm just honored to introduce Dr. Saeed Khan. He first spoke to the Citizens for Peace in September 2015, and he did a presentation on ISIS that was fantastic, and you can get it on our website if you were with us in 2015. And since, well, when it was over, he said, Colleen, anytime you want me to speak to the Citizens for Peace, just call me, I'll be there, like the song. And I said very quickly, I would like you to come every September. And he said, done. And he has never missed a meeting since then. And they're wonderful meetings. We have his PowerPoints or his whole video presentations, like I mentioned, on our website. So if you want to have more of this wonderful speaker, you will be able to hear more on our citizensnumber4peace.com. Now, Saeed is a teacher at Wayne State University, and he teaches in the Middle Eastern studies, including the culture, the history, and I am sure anyone that's taken one of his classes would be thrilled to take more, because he is such an interesting speaker. He has that talent, a talent to get points across in the most interesting and entertaining ways. He is a contributor to NPR and also WDET, Detroit Today, and he's on the panel of CBC's Turning Point. And so he is a figure that travels the world. He's so knowledgeable, and you will enjoy his presentation so much. You're going to be so glad that you tuned in today to Dr. Saeed Khan. Thanks, Saeed.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope you're all safe and well. And let's just go ahead and get it out of the way. You let me know next September. We'll figure something out. It's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and I think that we can certainly take stock in that. I don't know what's the more shocking passage of time, that it's been 20 years since 9/11, or that the Kardashians were on for 14 years and now they're finally ending their run. Thank you. But anyways, it's also very strange to not be traveling. I mean, it's taught me a lot. It's taught me how to recenter and recalibrate things, and certainly to enjoy, like, that wonderful meditation exercise. Sometimes it's okay to be at sea level or someplace that's not 40,000 feet in the sky. So tonight, I thought we would talk about, obviously, the big elephant in the room being COVID. And I remember when Colleen asked me if I would talk about America after COVID-19, I think we probably both were hoping that we would be over COVID-19 by now, and that we would actually be talking about something prospective. But like Lucy in the Peanuts cartoon, it looks like the ball keeps getting lifted up and the goalposts keep shifting a little bit further, which is fine, because I think it provides us with more of an opportunity to really see how much the world is changing, some of it because of COVID, and some of it for other reasons, which are somewhat related from a political perspective. But more looking than just at COVID's end, I think we have to consider what kind of trajectory is America taking moving forward, and what will America look like after this pandemic will end. And so let's go ahead and use that as a point of departure, and I'm going to go ahead and look to share my screen here, which, oh dear, let me just bring that up now. There we go. Okay, I should have started from here. Okay, so as we're looking at how to cope with the disruption that has come about as a result of COVID-19, I thought the first place we could take a look on the map is to see how far it has spread. And if you look at this map, it's really interesting and comforting that the continent of Africa, by and large, has mercifully escaped the main thrust of this pandemic. And at the same time, we see that there's this high concentration in Europe, certainly here in the United States, some parts of the Middle East, and then, of course, South and Southeast Asia. And I was just speaking to somebody in Australia yesterday, and who happens to live in Melbourne. And this is a state of Victoria, where Melbourne is located, that is now on further lockdown. And so you find that the ebb and the flow is something that is happening with this particular moment in time. Some of us have studied the Spanish flu, which occurred around the time of World War I, so about 100 years ago. Called the Spanish flu because Spain was neutral during the war, and so the only country that didn't have censorship on its journalists was Spain, and so they could report on this. Now historians indicate that it actually began in army bases in Kansas and made its way over to Europe and the rest of the world. At one point, over a quarter of the planet was infected, and about 3 to 10% of the population, in fact, lost their lives as a result of the pandemic. So certainly we can take a little bit more comfort that COVID-19 isn't as virulent, but still we see the kind of disruption that it has caused. And for those with more severe symptoms, it is certainly catastrophic. One of the byproducts of this, which you've got to love the irony, given the fact that the President of the United States had made a mantra of building a wall on the southern border, and of course getting Mexico to pay for it, is that, I don't know, this is that whole idea that you look into a mirror and it bounces right back at you. Or for those who subscribe to the notion of karma, I think all of those apply in this situation because, wow, the United States passport has become the leper of the international community. This is a map of the only countries in which a US passport holder can currently enter without any restrictions. So we've got Turkey, we've got, what is that, Zimbabwe down in Africa, and then a couple of countries in Central Europe. Other than that, we're pretty much getting used to being homebound. For some of us who, because of work and for other reasons, travel, it's remarkable how limiting it is and how unprecedented. I mean, if of all of the different disruptions, if you would have asked me when COVID-19 was happening, this was one that I would not have anticipated. And along with that, I wouldn't have anticipated the stigma that we are bearing as a result of this. And while other countries are slowly opening up, it really remains to be seen when and if in the near future, Americans will be welcomed back into other countries. As you know, the EU travel ban is in existence. And so along with Russia and Brazil, the United States is deemed to be a high-risk country. We have an economic impact, of course, because of Detroit Metro Airport handling 36 million passengers. And currently, we're looking at about a 60% reduction in flight operations. I mean, the numbers are astounding. And some of you probably remember how eerie it was in the week or so after 9/11. When there were just no aircraft in the sky because there was an absolute grounding of all air travel. And even today, if I happen to drive down to Dearborn or somewhere near the airport, that frequency of flights just isn't there. And again, for someone who basically sets his watch to the rhythm of flights, it's very unnatural in how it doesn't sound and how it doesn't feel. When we're looking at disruptions, and I mentioned World War I, it's perhaps important to understand where America was located in its sense of power, in its sense of influence around the world. And this was a time when a lot of empires were coming to an end. Before World War I, you had the Romanov Empire in Russia, you had the Hohenzollern Empire in Germany, you had the Habsburg Empire in Austria-Hungary, you had the Ottoman Empire in Turkey in the Middle East, and of course you had the British Empire. And like one big musical chairs game, when the music stopped, the only one that had the chair was the British Empire, and it continued for at least another 40 years or so. It gave the United States this wonderful opportunity because it was basically keeping its powder dry to now decide how it was going to leverage itself. And even after World War I, the United States decided that they really didn't want to go in fully and become the empire that they then became after World War II. Part of this was, of course, aided by the Great Depression and the desire to take a much more inward look at securing the US economy. And we saw this, of course, with President Franklin Roosevelt, but also because I think the United States recognized that the different parties in Europe in particular were inevitably going to go ahead and battle it out. And of course, that culminates into World War II from 1939 to 1945. And if you take a look at the map, in here we have it as the early 1960s, but for all intents and purposes, really after 1945, we go from this wonderfully multicolored map into one where you've really got two major color families here, the blues and the reds. And this was the kind of binary way that we remember, certainly before 1990, how we were taught to view the world. It was the NATO countries, or the so-called West, or the First World, and then of course you had the big Russian bear, or the Soviet bear, and the Warsaw Pact. And this kind of duality was something that was really baked into the cake about how we were supposed to see the world. It completely shaped American foreign policy, and it shaped a lot of attitudes that other countries had toward us. And so you were either on our side of the ledger or you were on the other side of the ledger. And what was interesting is that for the United States, particularly in the Eisenhower administration, neutrality was not an option. If you were seen, or if you projected yourself as a neutral country, with the exception of Scandinavia and Switzerland, you were vulnerable to the Soviet Union gobbling you up into their side of things. So, of course, this then plays out in a variety of different ways with proxy wars that then put the United States and the Soviet Union at odds with one another, but not directly, and not the shedding of blood directly. Of course, if you speak to those who were involved in those countries that were where the proxy wars were being fought, they certainly paid for it with their own blood and treasure, whether it was in Indochina, whether it was in Central America or South America, or certainly across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the world has changed. After the Cold War ended in 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, there was an exaltation that came out of Washington and was echoed in many Western capitals, whether it was London or in Paris, or back then, because Berlin was not the capital of the unified Germany, from Bonn, that the West had won, communism had been defeated, Western liberal democracy was now going to be the way that we all sailed on into the sunset, into a kind of 1,000-year peace. It didn't really work out that way. There was a lot of smaller disruptions that were still there. There were power vacuums that were created. Many of you remember, of course, the Balkan Wars, which were a very painful and very brutal campaign in the early part of the 1990s with Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Central Asia also had a power vacuum after the Soviet Union pulls out of Afghanistan. And then, of course, we have the Middle East starting to erupt again with Saddam Hussein after the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War, where the United States had, along with many Western allies, backed Iraq to try to neutralize Iran in those days. So a lot happening at that time. And I think it's important to consider then that how much of this was naivete, how much of this was hubris on the part of the United States, that there was going to be no further disruption, that there was not going to be any challenge to its authority, to its dominance, toward its supremacy. Well, that doesn't always work out that way. And for any of you who've ever watched a soap opera, you know that the villain never actually dies. He may lay low for a while, but then he comes up. And I remember my mom used to watch Days of Our Lives, and the arch villain on there was Stefano Di Mera. And he was there from the late 70s into the 80s. And I remember years later, going by a television and seeing Days of Our Lives, and guess who was still around? Stefano Di Mera. So I think this idea then of there always being the threat or the specter of disruption is part of world history. And here we have to understand that the Soviet Union may have been defeated. There may have been now an overhaul to Russia. It'd be difficult to call it a democracy, especially with Vladimir Putin there, but a non-communist entity, that here a proud people, a proud heritage, and a country which certainly has not only a lot of land, but still a lot of nuclear weapons, was not going to go gentle into that good night. it was not going to allow what it perceived to be the United States rubbing its nose proverbially in geopolitics. And what happens is in the 1990s, we see a series of events and perhaps miscues on the part of American policy to take a look then at, for example, expanding NATO into what had been previously the Warsaw Pact countries of Central Europe, places like Czechoslovakia, now Czechia and Slovakia, as well as into the former Yugoslavia. But then deciding to go even further to welcome into NATO and the European Union former Soviet republics like the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Georgia, maybe the Ukraine. And when you have somebody like a Vladimir Putin, he's going to say, that's too much, guys. And similarly, we have this idea that China in 1989, after the Tiananmen Square, a very oppressive clampdown of student protests, that China was simply going to remain dormant. Well, it didn't. And in fact, over then the next 30 years, China became a juggernaut. And so what we now find ourselves in is not only the idea that Western liberal democracy is not the only option on the table, but you have a China which is going to move forward and essentially shape the world for at least the remainder of the 21st century, due in large part to what we call the New Silk Road. So in 1368, the founder of the Ming Dynasty decided that he was going to shut down the Silk Road at that time, this overland route of commerce that spanned all the way from China going into Europe, because he was afraid of ideas coming back into China which might be disruptive. That didn't matter. Nature finds a way and commerce finds a way, and so it opens up the sea routes. And in fact, this was one of the major reasons why Columbus was trying to find a better route to China and to the East Indies in 1492. Well, the Ming Dynasty is over, Mao Zedong is over, and we have a China that is led by Xi Jinping, taking the ideas of one of Mao's successors, a man by the name of Deng Xiaoping. And I remember being a kid living in Houston, and Deng Xiaoping paid a goodwill visit to the United States. And one of the places he came was Houston. And they took him to the rodeo, put on a big 10-gallon hat for him. But he was trying to learn what makes America tick. And he was fascinated by, of course, agriculture, but he was also fascinated by manufacturing. And Deng Xiaoping's policies and his vision are now being played out in China when it has become this manufacturing hub. But of course, there needs to be supply routes, there needs to be export routes, and China has now embarked on this rather ambitious project called the Belt and Road Initiative. They are investing somewhere along the lines of $1.5 trillion to go ahead and create these routes going all the way from Eastern China to the Dutch port of Rotterdam, and then also sea routes going from China across the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and then even finding a way into the Mediterranean. Just to give you some context here, 1.5 trillion is half of what the United States spent over the last 20 years in their wars with Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's an opportunity cost of where do you want to put the money. Now, when we take a look at China's global investment, there is probably very few countries where China is not investing, and they don't invest in only one sector. One of the big areas in the United States where China's investing is pig farms, because there, of course, is a big appetite, pun intended, for pork in China. And so here we find that land is available relatively inexpensively for what they're planning. There's already the infrastructure, and they have the means and the methods to go ahead and import that meat back into China. But if you take a look particularly at South Asia, and if you take a look at Africa, And if you take a look at Europe, the reason why China is investing so heavily is in part to go ahead and create the infrastructure for their own Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road, but then also realizing that in order to keep this economic juggernaut going of manufacturing, they need raw materials and natural resources. And that is one of the things that they have been doing all over Africa in order to get the minerals, in order to get the various natural resources. And what China does is they go in there, they build the roads, they build the bridges, they build the transportation system, they build the ports, which will then aid them. But of course, they are, of course, usable by the local population. As the local population also wants to develop itself, China will loan the money, oftentimes essentially locking them in because, of course, they may not be able to ever pay this money back because the amounts are so large. And here we see on this graphic, all in the red spots, places where China has loaned money. As you see, particularly along the coastal regions of Africa. You see a place like Pakistan, just to the west of India, moving up into Afghanistan as well, across to Iran. And we'll talk about the actual amount of money that's involved with Iran in a brief minute. Now, as I said, you've got Iran, which the United States has made into a pariah state. It seems so long ago, but it really wasn't. 5 years ago, the Obama administration had done what seemed to be the impossible, actually made an agreement with Iran to have Iran dismiss its nuclear weapon ambitions. The so-called JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, if you will, the P5+1 deal, was in place. And Iran, according to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, was in full compliance of keeping its nuclear enrichment or its uranium enrichment at minimal levels for civilian use only. The President of the United States, or the new President of the United States, decided to go ahead and pull out of that. And now we find that Iran has resumed its uranium enrichment to pre-nuclear deal levels. It is still ambiguous whether or not it is seeking a nuclear weapons program, but clearly the propaganda that comes out of the Beltway would indicate that they're going to probably come up with a nuclear weapon before we do a vaccine for COVID. So who knows what's the real case. But what we do have here is a couple of people who seem to be rather happy with one another. And that is Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, meeting to then ink a deal where China is going to be investing in Iran with $400 billion over the next 25 years. Now, why is this important? Well, Iran, being made a pariah by the United States, can feel emboldened that it is not going to be a pariah everywhere. And the United States is probably now losing its leverage to really be able to get anybody to threaten Iran in the way that the saber rattling has been going for the last several years. Because now Iran has a benefactor that is a nuclear power, that is an economic power, as is China. China is looking at this as a deal to help bolster a major country in its Silk Road, and also to offset American power in the region. Now, all of the rhetoric about China being the source of the so-called Wuhan virus, or the China virus as the rhetoric goes, has really fallen on deaf ears by the rest of the world. The rest of the world seems to be far more interested in practicing what's called realpolitik, understanding the practicalities of China's power. It was interesting to see how for years many of these countries felt reticent to speak out against the United States, feeling that perhaps even the US was, dare I use the word, bullying them. these countries now feel emboldened because their relationship with China doesn't seem as oppressive. It does not seem as though it is through bullying. It seems as though it's much more mutually beneficial. In the case of the China-Iran alliance, China can gain oil, which it needs desperately to keep its engines running, both metaphorically and literally. And because of this deal, given the fact that oil is traded on the world market using the US dollar, this is going to be a return to the barter system. Here, China invests in Iran, and Iran pays back with oil. So it's a fairly tidy deal. And of course, you also see then the potential of countries starting to circumvent the dollar as the means of commerce and currency in favor of even cryptocurrency like Bitcoin and some of these other financial instruments. So again, when we emerge from COVID, these processes are already underway. While the United States is in quarantine from the rest of the world, so to speak, these deals, these agreements, these accords are continuing unabated. Another one dealing with China is perhaps even closer to home, and that involves a NATO ally, which is Turkey. And here we have Mevlut Cavusoglu and again, Foreign Minister Wang Yi meeting to ice another deal. The Silk Road goes through Turkey after it has passed through Iran. And this is a strategically very important country. And here we see that the current administration is genuinely conflicted about what to do. On the one hand, you've got President Recep Erdogan, who's a strong man. He talks a tough game. He is defiant about the United States, going so far as even buying advanced missile systems from Russia. Imagine a NATO country buying Russian weapons. The United States has certainly been wringing its hands to do something to try to get Turkey to change its ways. It has been unsuccessful, partly because President Trump actually likes Erdogan being a strongman, and as a result of it, it's either bromance or boycott. It can't really make up his mind. But this again is demonstrating that American influence is definitely being compromised in places which were considered to be stalwart allies, or put in another way, areas like Iran, where there was a consensus that the United States was going to call the shots there. Here we find a fascinating picture. We have President Hassan Rouhani from Iran, Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, looks, that look on his face seems a lot like Melania Trump, but I don't know, maybe I'm just reading too much into it. And then here we find President Erdogan meeting at a conference in Astana in Kazakhstan. And part of this particular alliance has to do with oil, and particularly oil in Syria. Putin is somebody who has been studying the United States really since the end of the Cold War. Between Erdogan and Putin, they have essentially taken over geopolitical policy regarding Syria. I remember all those years ago in 2011 and during the Arab Spring, and when things started to happen in Syria, there was a lot of two minds on the part of the Obama administration whether to go in or not. Now we find that the United States really has limited influence within Syria. Where they're trying is about oil that is being discovered there. Now, why is this important? Well, Turkey just announced that they have discovered in their territory in the Mediterranean, their exclusive economic zone, a potential 320 cubic meters of natural gas, which is one of the largest caches that has been known to have been discovered. If that happens, Turkey is no longer just an energy conduit. Right now, Turkey is pivotal because natural gas pipelines and oil pipelines from the Caspian and from Russia go through Turkey to the European Union. 80% of the European Union's natural gas needs come through this particular channel. If Turkey goes ahead and is able to, within this decade, extract this natural gas, it now becomes a major energy producer and exporter as well. So it can then go ahead and resist efforts that the United States may have, or the European Union, of trying to demonize it, try to marginalize it, or try to pressure it. Well, the reason why natural gas is also being seen as perhaps a little bit more stable is that the world has a glut on the price of oil currently. Here you see that going back to April, the price of a barrel of oil had dropped below $15. Today it is around, I think, $36.13. It is far off some of its highs. I mean, here you see even at the end of 2019, oil was trading about $60 a barrel. 2 years ago, it was around $100 a barrel. So coming down to 1/3 is quite severe. Now here we see, for example, the oil producers of the world. The United States, yes, has become the largest net oil producer in the world, followed by Saudi Arabia and Russia. You've got Canada, Iran, Iraq. China does produce oil, as does the UAE, Kuwait, and Brazil. But take a look here at the cost of oil production. So in order to break even, the price of oil has to be around $52.50 for the UK to then make money off this. If you look down for the United States, the price of oil has to be around $36.20. So right now it is dropped slightly below that by about 7 cents, which means that it's actually costing the United States more money to produce a barrel of oil than they can get for it on the open market. Some countries have a far lower production cost. Like if you see Saudi Arabia, it's below $10 a barrel to produce it. So $36, no problem, still making money. Part of this is that the countries where it's expensive, like the UK, they get their oil from the North Sea. It's very expensive to then try to mine it from the North Sea. Similar with Canada and the United States, most of that oil production is through shale oil. And so that is a very expensive process to happen. The Saudis and many of the countries in the Middle East, they do it the old-fashioned way. They just get it right out of the desert. But that has been driving a lot of the Saudi and the Gulf Arab states reforms that they're planning. I was in Saudi Arabia in February, and they have a rather ambitious project called Vision 2030, where they're building these brand new, very state-of-the-art cities. They're trying to promote tourism. The very young Crown Prince is trying to implement reforms and make Saudi Arabia's narrative move away from the Puritanism of Wahhabism. But the price of oil dropping is still going to mean that they cannot match that reform in the way that they had thought they could back when oil was trading at about $80, $90, $100 a barrel. They have to really tighten their belts a little bit more. Here we see those natural gas pipelines, and you see this crisscross going through Turkey, around Turkey, as well as Russia. So this helps explain then the shifting in attitudes that countries have toward the United States, and also the idea of how the United States has to then change its playbook. They cannot go ahead and act with these countries in the way that they did in the past. It's just like an iPhone. You need to go ahead and have the updates. The world is no longer unipolar as it was right after the Cold War. Now there are some significant players, both superpowers like Russia and China, as well as other very important countries like Turkey and Iran in the region, who are going to be able to provide a counterweight to American influence. Now, Of course, any discussion about American influence would be lacking if we didn't talk about the prodigal son-in-law of President Trump, and that is a special envoy, Jared Kushner, who makes the first direct flight between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. As you recall, there was a lot of fanfare that yet another Arab country has in fact normalized relations with Israel. And here we find, for example, envoys from Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and from the United States, meeting in Abu Dhabi. It's weird that they call this a peace deal, because that would suggest that there had been a war between these countries, and the UAE and Israel were never at war. And at the same time, they also really weren't that antagonistic to each other. It's fairly a dirty little secret that the UAE and Israel have had relations at the highest levels. The governments have been talking. There's speculation that Israel has provided security for the monarchy of the UAE to make sure that it does not get overthrown, to ensure stability in the region, especially because of this oil. What this deal has essentially done is a few things. One, it has brought out into the open something which people suspected for a very long time. Two, as a result of this and the circuit breakers being off, the UAE has access to the very burgeoning tech market and tech sector in Israel. And conversely, Israel's tech sector has access to a tremendous level of capital that the UAE can invest in it. The other thing it did was it bailed out both the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration. Netanyahu had clearly gotten very far over his skis by pledging that he was going to annex parts of the West Bank. That didn't really come about, because he then retracted it in the name of the deal. Trump's Middle East peace plan was a disaster that Kushner had set up, and this gave him a way to save face a little bit and to move attention away from the domestic landscape and his handling of COVID. But at the core of this, and why the UAE swooped in, was because of arms sales. And the UAE does pay cash. This is the F-35 Raptor fighter, which is the most advanced fighter in the American arsenal. And here we see two such planes in the Israeli Air Force flying on the coast of the Mediterranean. The UAE now is, it seems, going to be acquiring this advanced fighter as well. And again, what we have seen, and despite the fact that the Iran nuclear deal went in 2015, there has been a steady increase in the amount of arms sales that the United States has had to places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, into the hundreds of billions of dollars. And as you recall, President Trump was even extolling these deals when it came to here Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and the deals that were being made with Saudi Arabia. In fact, the visuals are very helpful, both, I suppose, to him and to us, as to what was being sold. And why this deal is particularly nefarious is that the president used a questionable provision to circumvent congressional approval for the deal. And so again, this idea of the executive branch bypassing the checks and balances is certainly a cause for greater concern. Here's the military expenditure, and here we see that the United States spends more than the next 10 countries combined. Even China has a budget which is less than half of that of the United States. But if you take a look at Saudi Arabia, $67.6 billion in annual expenditure for a country of only 23 million. So here we find that it has 1/4 of the military expenditure of China, China has a population of 1.4 billion compared to 23 million. That again helps to inform what some of these deals and these treaties are really all about, especially when you see that Saudi Arabia is the biggest purchaser of American weapons, followed by Australia, and then lo and behold, the United Arab Emirates. So we have to then go ahead and put on our cynical caps to recognize that on the one hand, President Trump is disparaging the Pentagon leadership, accusing them of trying to put us to war and supporting the military-industrial complex, while at the same time it seems as though the president is doing his best to facilitate the military-industrial complex with those countries who seem quite ready to go ahead and buy our weapon systems. Why else would the United States military be involved? And despite the fact that there's a pledge to pull out of Syria even, American forces are in Syria, but not to fight ISIS. They're there to protect the quote-unquote vital national security assets of certain oil fields, which are part of an American conglomerate. These oil fields happen to be in Kurdish-controlled northern Syria. This is another reason why the United States and Turkey are at odds with one another, because the Turks don't like the Kurds, because the Kurds are looking to have their own independent homeland at the expense of Turkish soil, among other territories. And so here then the Kurds are being used as essentially a diplomatic and political football with the United States, Turkey involved. Now, Putin is tolerating this American presence in the region as long as the United States doesn't overextend what Putin would like to have happen. It's important to realize that Russia is physically on the ground in Syria, both with Air Force bases, with military personnel, and with a naval base in the Eastern Mediterranean on the coast of Syria. At no other time, even during the Cold War, was there that level of Russian penetration in the Middle East. So clearly we see that there has been a massive shift when it comes to the United States and really its influence to keep others out. So I thought that this cartoon was quite telling. Who's really making that decision? That on the one hand, you see the president saying, go stop our involvement in the Middle East, but that involvement is now peacekeeping for oil fields. So the great game, as it's sometimes called, never really ends. It just morphs into another soap operatic season. So what are some of the opportunities that perhaps the US should look at? I mean, I don't want this to be seen that America has completely lost its positionality in the world. Things are not that great right now, especially given the way that the rest of the world perceives us. They still, I think, hold some level of optimism that the American public, or at least part of it, can help right the ship, so to speak, and that it is resilient enough to allow its institutions to somehow weather the storm, and that if there is a restoration, a leaner, hopefully not meaner America is certainly going to be welcomed back into the international community when travel is allowed. But things have really changed because the level of respect that countries, both adversaries and allies, have to the United States has certainly declined. I don't know what's worse, to be feared, to be hated, or to not be taken seriously. And it seems as though in that multiple choice, it's not even all of the above anymore. It seems like a lot of countries are moving straight to letter C. But wow, there are places that we can start even in our own backyard after, of course, NAFTA has been revamped as the USMCA. Canada and Mexico are still countries with which we can deal, of course, provided we can get back into Canada. I was reading an anecdote of a friend of mine who's a dual citizen, Canadian-American, And he spends his time in America. He works here in Washington, but he'd gone to Canada for a couple of months to spend the summer at his summer home. When he traveled across, he could get into Canada by a land border because he has a Canadian passport. They were very polite. They asked him questions about what was his connection to Canada. He says, I'm a citizen. How long was he planning on staying in Canada? They asked him what were the details of his quarantine plan. Where was he going to quarantine? Excuse me. How was he going to access groceries? How was he going to access other necessities? They then interviewed him for roughly about 15 minutes. And then once they were assured of everything, he was allowed in. As he's coming back into the United States, bringing back some furniture and other supplies that were at the summer home, he stopped by the border. They interrogate him for an hour. They search his car. But here's what they asked him. Are you bringing in any marijuana? Are you bringing in any alcohol, any firearms? Are you involved with any kind of subversive activity? Do you have any kind of criticisms of the Trump administration? Not a single question was asked about COVID-19. And to invoke Dickens, this really is not the tale of two cities, it's the tale of two countries and how they handle COVID-19. But there is a familiarity between us and Canada, between us and Mexico. These are still, relatively speaking, stable political regimes. And there's a matter of convenience. And I think that if America is going to start to rebuild, it needs to rebuild in its own backyard first. But it's also providing a new opportunity. As I showed you, Africa has mercifully been rather immune to the very large and widespread impact of COVID-19. Central America and South America, similarly, compared to other places, have been able to weather this storm. We can create new bases of relationships there. Of course, it's hard for many of these countries to forget American involvement in Central Asia and in South America, as well as Africa during the Cold War. But as you see in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, they were able to move past the darkness of apartheid in a very smooth way. I was in Cape Town in November and I was completely wowed by the people, by the scenery, and by just the vibe, if you will, of everything. And then create new areas of engagement instead of weapons. Military expenditure seems to be one of the big areas where America engages with countries right now, but artificial intelligence, healthcare services, education, e-commerce, there's a lot that can come about after COVID-19 because, again, people do want to work with America. They find Americans to be overall in the game, understanding and easy to work with. But that, of course, really depends on how we're moving forward as a country. And first of all, of course, above all, how do we get done with COVID before we get to a post-COVID-19 reality? I love this quote about the future of international relations by Kenneth Waltz. As nature abhors a vacuum, international politics abhors unbalanced power. And on the one hand, it is painful to see as an American this kind of stigma that we face that, I mean, I can't even get into England right now. But at the same time, we also see that there is something to be said about the planet and other countries moving toward restoring balance. Perhaps that period of time between 1990, when the Cold War ended, moving into at least around the time of 2001, it seemed as though the United States enjoyed really being at the top of the pyramid, probably didn't play things as well as it could have. We are certainly paying the price for going it alone. We're paying the price for ignoring some of our own challenges and deficiencies in infrastructure. And certainly we are paying the price for political ineptitude. But there is, of course, this promise that as we move out of COVID-19, if there's enough people who are being reflective enough to see how do we then revamp ourselves, maybe reinvent and redefine ourselves, America can do quite well in a world where there is actually balance. So with that, I would like to thank you and move to questions, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's see who has a question here. Please, raise your hand right next to your face like this if you have a question. No questions? Wait, did Bob Frank oh, here, Rich Peacock. Okay, can you?
Hey, Reverend Rich.
Hello there, Saeed. Good to see your smiling face.
Likewise.
What about the relationship with China? It's very mixed up, and China is a real economic power.
So China is, of course, very complex for several reasons. As you know, of course, there's the atrocities going on in Xinjiang, which are increasingly being defined as a genocide against the Uyghur population. There is the near catastrophically bad trade negotiations with China. Again, I can't even use the word irony because that's now becoming so overused. We think about this administration withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, which Reverend Rich, you and I, of course, were so involved in trying to persuade the Congress that although not perfect, there was still merit in the deal. But the other agreement, the international accord from which this administration has withdrawn the country is, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was intended to serve as a firewall against the unbridled spread of Chinese influence. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to reel that marlin back into the boat. The reason is that now, first of all, there's a lack of confidence of many of the Pacific Rim countries about whether the United States is even capable of seeing things through agreements that it was, in fact, the architect of in the first place and was rallying everybody around, getting them ginned up. The other is that a lot of countries have now accepted, acknowledged, resigned to the fact of China and are making deals on an ad hoc basis with them. Japan is doing so. Vietnam, of course, is doing so. And it seems as though China is quite receptive to negotiate and to agree to a very bilateral way of these kinds of agreements. The question becomes, as Americans who are used to a certain standard of influence and power, for lack of better words, that the US has exercised for so many decades, to now be on the other side of that, to no longer be the final say and the final word, is going to take an awful lot of getting used to. The good news is that with globalization, the way that it is, our economies, our interactions are so enmeshed with one another that we have to inadvertently root for China so that we are okay ourselves, and vice versa. China is not going to allow the United States to collapse because we are its largest single consumer market. Now, if we can move past some of the political ineptitude, if we can move past some of the political propaganda to have a deal that is effective, that actually reaches people, that doesn't decimate the agriculture and the farm industry of this country with the tariffs, I think that there is some promise. What we need in Washington is experts who understand the Chinese psyche. The Chinese first and foremost, don't think about things on a quarterly basis. For them, it's not a quarter that is 90 days. A quarter for them is 90 years. Their scale of time is completely different. Their way of prioritizing economic policies, the way that they handle even cultural expression is something that's different than what we understand in the West. I always like to give this as an example. Yes, maybe they're going into places like sub-Saharan Africa, and yes, maybe they are exploiting countries, but they don't bring with that cultural imperialism. No country in Africa is being coerced or compelled to change to use chopsticks. The way that European colonization, the way that European imperialism really inferiorized the indigenous populations of so many people. But China is, whether we like it or not, the grand project that we have to focus on moving forward, and particularly understanding how do we deal with China with this new Belt and Road Initiative. Unfortunately, the way that the United States is still thinking of how to operate is to create disruptions along the road. In kind of a very sad metaphor, it's almost as though the US wants to go ahead and plant IEDs along the Silk Road in order to disrupt it. And I don't think that that is overall very helpful. The United States has its own vulnerabilities, it has its own weaknesses that can be exploited because, again, two can play at this game. There's a way, though, for the United States to take this as an opportunity to become more competitive. There's a way for the United States to go ahead and harness its own resources, to go ahead then and develop both the intellectual output as well as the kinds of goods and services which can complement what China has to offer. But antagonism, I think, is a vast waste of time. Colleen. Mute?
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Hi, Saeed. I just read recently that the US has 4,000 military bases around the world, and China and Russia have 35 combined.
Yeah.
We are spending all of our treasure on military might. We have no State Department to speak of. What do you think is possible for us to get out of that military industrial complex mindset that has hooks into all of the Congress and senators that have, you know, money flowing in for destruction instead of rebuilding our world? Do you think we have any hope? We've been doing this 18 years. We've tried to lobby. We've had, you know, all kinds of things going on, trying to help people realize this is a waste of our money. Is there any end in sight to that?
So the adage says that even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I think that the president actually used that up recently when he talked about the military industrial complex. It's the first time, I think, since Eisenhower that especially a Republican president has even acknowledged its existence and how nefarious it is. The first time that I went to Washington as an adult was when I was in college. It was late 80s. And I remember feeling that Washington still had this kind of sleepy feel to it. Things, of course, you had the monuments, you had all the government buildings, but like Northern Virginia, like Arlington, was still relatively, I mean, I'm not going to say it was like, say, Richmond or someplace in the hinterland, but it wasn't as though it is now. Now, when I go to Washington, I look at the skyscrapers in Roslyn and in Arlington, and all along as you travel around the Beltway, around the city. And these are the names that are up on the buildings: Raytheon, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed Martin. They're all defense contractors.
Yes.
They have multiple buildings around. And so it doesn't take a genius to see and to perceive who's holding the power and the kind of influence that you said through lobbying and the such. And that's not even just on K Street. That's just the number of employees they have, the defense contractors, and how many people are wedded into the system. Um, just one point of update. China has created somewhere along the lines of 18 artificial islands stretching from the South China Sea all the way to the Horn of Africa. They have developed deep water ports in Bangladesh, in Myanmar. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Rohingya were displaced. It was for a Chinese port there. Sri Lanka, as well as in Pakistan. And essentially, they have now encircled India. I mean, India has really got to be sweating some bullets. But part of this is for naval use, and part of this is for their merchant marine, their own shipping. So they're now going to become a two-ocean power. But you're right, they don't need to go ahead and have this over-leveraged, overextended series, because for them, they're going to take the resources from these countries and then they're going to move back. The Chinese model is more like franchising, whereas the United States feels as though they need to have their corporate branches everywhere. There's a moment, I mean, this is going to be audacious. This is certainly going to be considered radical, but I think what needs to happen is we need to go ahead and bring the troops home, and we need to redirect them and these defense contracts into rebuilding the infrastructure of this country.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I agree.
It's I mean, imagine how easy it would be a sell to the American public to say that your taxpayer money that was going into a $750 billion defense budget is now going to be going in, let's even say, 600 billion into fixing the roads, making sure we're all Wi-Fi compliant, our own 5G instead of relying on China. It could really be something.
It surely would. I'm only hoping. I may not live to see it, but I'm still putting that thought and energy out into the world.
Look,
Thank you.
it's like the movie Inception. I mean, it's always planting the kernel in there.
That's what we've been doing. Thank you so much.
I think Chuck has a question. I see his hand up. If he wants to unmute, yeah. Chuck, yeah. Let me see if we can. I think Tata can go ahead and unmute him.
Okay, there I am. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. How you doing, Chuck?
Always good to hear from you. Listen, I listened to Norm Finkelstein, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Sure.
He went on talking about the Palestinians not too long ago, and I was really distressed to hear that, you know, he painted it as a pretty sad state of affairs for them right now. He was mentioning how, you know, really Hezbollah and the PLO are just so corrupt. They're not even, you know, they're not even looking out for the citizenry, and they really don't have anybody on the planet at present to talk, you know, to advocate for their cause. And I found it so sad. And they asked him, they said, well, he painted such a bleak picture. And you know, they asked him, I said, well, what, you know, what's the prognosis? And he really couldn't come up with anything. And he just says it's a sad situation. I wondered if you had a different spin on it, or if it was the same for you. It just sounded so sad to me. Also, I wanted to just throw in one more thing he said. I just thought it was so cool what he said. He said they were talking about the Gulf states. He says, Gulf states? They're not Gulf states. They're independently owned gas stations.
Yep. You know, Fareed Zakaria referred to them as trust fund economies because of the oil. No, I think the points that you raised are very important, Chuck. Far be it for me to go ahead and be able to improve upon anything that Norman says. Really a very insightful person. Look, when it comes to, as you said, to show the ineptitude of Hezbollah, Hezbollah controls the docks at the port of Beirut. And of course, we know too painfully well what happened in Beirut last month with this explosion of ammonium nitrate. I mean, just the sheer volume of it devastated Beirut, a city that has always been trying to rebuild after of course, a series of self-destructive moves, and some, of course, out of the war in 2006 with Israel. Similarly with the PA and with Hamas. A part of the very tough pill to swallow regarding the Palestinians is it's done. I mean, the Palestinian cause, other than it being promoted as a moral issue, as far as any real change going, is really over. It's become cynical to keep kicking the can and saying, yes, we support a two-state solution. Yes, we support a one-state solution, and expecting there to be some recourse for them. But I think if I were to give a caveat to Israel about this, there is still a belief, it seems, or perhaps a naivete, that Israel controls its own destiny, that Israel has its own full sovereignty. Israel's getting played by the big powers. It serves a purpose right now, which is geopolitical, geostrategic. But at the same time, the narrative about Israel in this country has shifted dramatically over the last couple of years. It is no longer even in the control, I would say, of the Jewish contingent within AIPAC. I would suggest that the narrative has been overtaken and controlled by the evangelical movement. And I think we're now seeing a divergence when it comes to whether they in fact do have the same interests, the same empathy, and the same sentiment toward the Jewish state. Many of these actions that are being promulgated by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who himself is an avowed evangelical. I mean, the fact that he spoke to the RNC from Israel was, and again, a word that's been used to death with this administration, unprecedented, is quite remarkable. And I read Faust by Goethe and by Marlowe back in the day, and it seems as though this is increasingly looking like a Faustian bargain that Israel is making and has made with the US, with the military-industrial complex as well. And of course, the first casualty of this has been the Palestinians. But I'm not sure that Israel as a nation is one that can really claim that they have the kind of security and the safety that they have been striving for very long. I see that the great powers, and again now with the emergence even more of countries like Russia and China, Israel has always had this challenge of location, size of population and country, and trying to have a purpose by which it can then demonstrate its indispensability in the broader geopolitics. Cold War, it was seen as a country that was arguably on the front line from the spread of communism and Soviet expansion into the region. After the Cold War, seen as a bulwark against Islamic extremism. Now, with the absence of both of those, Israel is then trying to assert itself in a way. It's tried to go ahead, along with the Gulf states, of constructing this narrative that the existential threat is Iran. That hasn't really been successful at all. And even more so now with China coming into the fold, China is either going to push back on that effort or is going to assure people that we'll take care of Iran so that it doesn't have any kind of hostile intention. That then means that Israel has to focus on itself. There are severe ideological tectonic plates within Israel when it comes to the secular movement, when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox movement, when it comes to the settlers. The best and only hope for the Palestinians is that in the struggle that is occurring within Israel's domestic political landscape, that somebody wakes up and says, wow, maybe we should court the Palestinians within the struggle that we have. And that could then be used as a bargaining chip for the Palestinians to gain greater enfranchisement and a restoration of their dignity.
Thanks for your insight.
Thank you. Tada, it's 8:15. Is that what you were hoping for on the timeline? I think Tada has to unmute.
Unmute yourself, Tata.
So do we need,
Okay,
can I ask?
I was saying, I think we can go a little bit over
Okay.
8:15. Yeah, just not a whole lot, yeah. Okay, Kim.
Yeah, I was actually reading the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. There are 84 countries that have signed it. 44 have ratified. Once 50 are ratified, it, in a matter of, I think, 90 days, it becomes international law. That, I think, could possibly happen this year. And so what I've been searching for is, once it becomes international law, then how do we put pressure on the United States and other nuclear countries to abide by it? And so far, it's like a moral issue. There's a whole world kind of almost like it is a grassroots movement. Mm-hmm. There's over 500 organizations that are NGOs that are members of the international campaign. And then there's economic, mm-hmm. You know, like, but I don't know if even you were very aware of this.
Oh, no, look, I mean, the promise of these kinds of conventions are wonderful, provided that there's an enforcement mechanism. And what we've seen is two things. One is that the United Nations does not have a mechanism within itself for enforcement. It's always on the quote unquote honor system. Unfortunately, that honor system is dominated by the superpowers, and particularly the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council: Russia, China, England, France, and the United States. Now, all 5 of them happen to be nuclear powers, but then you also have countries like Pakistan and North Korea and India that are part of the so-called nuclear club, as well as Israel. Does that mean that you expand the UN Security Council to allow everyone? Is the admission qualification having the nuke? That would, on the one hand, be very, very disturbing. But at the same time, one could make the argument that those that have the nuclear capability will be the first to not want to use them, because they know that it would be futile to be able to be as cavalier about these. The whole notion of mutually assured destruction. Right now, we have a situation which is probably the powder keg of the world that no one is talking about beyond COVID, beyond the election, and that is what's happening between India and China. I mean, these are 2 countries that have actually had a war in 1962. There are 2 different areas on their borders where there is active conflict. One is in the west, near Kashmir, and the other is in the east near Bhutan. I don't think this is going to flare up into something that would be a nuclear conflagration, not because it's evenly balanced, but because I think nobody wants to be the next country to use a nuclear weapon. There's something about the fact that the United States is the only country ever to have used a nuclear weapon on another country, which ironically serves as a deterrent. No one wants the United States to lose its perfect record. And that's providing a kind of deterrent around the world for what they're doing. Now, at the same time, it does bring into question whether the United States moving forward is going to be as cavalier in flouting international law the way that it has been. You're probably aware that, I mean, look at how audacious this is. The US imposed sanctions on International Criminal Court investigators because, of course, they don't want ICC officials digging around and possibly bringing charges against the US. The US has already declared that they are not participants in the ICCJ, the International Criminal Courts of Justice. So the only reason that the US is able to do that at this stage is because they can exert the power to say no. That's an open question about whether the US is going to be in that position moving forward.
Okay,
yeah.
Can you just cut it short?
Yeah.
Maybe one
Sure.
more minute. One
Sure.
more minute.
So I think that if the US is really serious and they want to understand that they're not going to be in the level of power and authority and dominance that they even are right now, they should exercise a little bit more humility, and they should try to prop up these international conventions, these kinds of treaties, these kinds of resolutions, and be parties to them. Because as we saw at the end of World War I, World War II came about in large measure because the US was not part of the League of Nations, because the US Senate did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles for Wilson. The US needs to be engaged. The US should still leverage the kind of relevance and level of respect that it still has on the world stage. Because if it doesn't happen now, we're going to be sitting on the sidelines and having others dictate it for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we hope that you'll come back again.
Of course. I mean, Colleen's already locked me in for September. So absolutely.
I'm sorry, I want to unmute everybody. Just 1 second.
Bob, if you want, you can get a hold of me on Facebook.
Will do.
Okay.
Let's see. I don't see where, oh, there it is. Ask all to unmute. I don't know. I thought I could unmute everyone.
Bravo.
Thank you
Okay,
you all.
so you have to unmute
Great.
yourself. I can't.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy your board meeting then, and stay safe, stay well, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Saeed.
you.
Take care.
All right,
Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Just outstanding.
always.